On the evening of October 25, 2016, the quiet residents of a small South African village were startled when Louise Coca came running out of her home, in a panic, clutching her 3-year-old daughter in her arms. She was crying for help, claiming that her daughter had suddenly lost consciousness at that moment. No one could have guessed this incident would spark an investigation, uncovering shocking truths about a family's hidden life behind closed doors. Louise had filed for divorce from Christo Vanar in 2014, just a year after the birth of their daughter. Her decision was prompted by escalating threats and aggressive outbursts from her husband. Once a calm and caring auto mechanic, Chisto had transformed into someone prone to dangerous behavior, even threatening her life. This behavior left Louise with no choice but to seek a restraining order through the court system. Before her life with Christo spiraled into chaos, Louise believed she had finally found the right partner. She met Christo after a tumultuous divorce from her first husband, Freddie. That marriage, too, had brought her no happiness. When Christo entered her life, he seemed to be everything. Freddie was not hardworking, steady, and dependable. Their whirlwind romance soon led to marriage, and they welcomed their first child, a boy named Johan. 2 years later, their daughter Poppy was born. However, Louise's life had been marked by hardship long before these events. In 1984, at the age of 10, she experienced the devastating loss of her father, with whom she had shared an especially close bond. His passing was a crushing blow soon after Louise's mother remarried, but her new husband brought turmoil into their lives. This man introduced hostility and mistreatment into the household, constantly belittling and undermining those around him. He was known for his temper and would often resort to physical aggression to exert control. The years Louise spent under his roof left a lasting mark on her, fostering a deep sense of inadequacy and self-doubt. When Louise finally left her childhood home, she was determined to find freedom at any cost. Her first marriage was a rushed decision, one that brought more pain than peace. When she left Freddie, she hoped Christo would be her fresh start. But this new union proved just as damaging. What made Christo's transformation especially heartbreaking was that it seemed to coincide with the birth of their children. Their daughter Poppy, born in 2013, quickly became the center of attention for those who knew the family. Her blonde hair and striking blue eyes captured everyone's admiration. However, what could have been a picture-perfect family life soon unraveled into something far darker. By the time Lisa filed for divorce, she had come to understand that she couldn't allow the horrors of her own childhood to be repeated. She had grown up enduring hostility and constant humiliation, and she was determined to protect her children from a similar fate. In 2015, Cobus Kamore relocated to Orania, searching for a fresh start after a series of failed marriages. The Closet community offered him a job at a local supermarket where Louise Coca was already employed. It was there that their paths crossed at first glance. Koba seemed like an ordinary man, but his past, marked by divorces and frequent conflicts, raised concerns. His former wives described him as someone with a tendency toward aggressive behavior, and his relationship with his children was reportedly limited to court-mandated financial support. By this time, Louise had already settled into life in Orania. Though she was still adjusting to her new routine, she was busy setting up her home and caring for her 2 children, Johan and Poppy, as well as her 14-year-old stepdaughter, Marissa, who had moved in with Louise after a lengthy legal battle, took on many of the household responsibilities, allowing Louise to focus on her work. The teenager became a caretaker for her younger siblings, acting as a second mother to them. Despite the challenges, the family gradually found a sense of stability. Court orders had placed strict limits on Christo's interactions with his family. He was allowed supervised visits with Johan and Poppy 3 times a month, always in the presence of a social worker. Additionally, he was permitted weekly phone calls with his son and daughter, most of which were recorded to outsiders. He appeared to be a devoted father, but Louise claimed this was merely an act. She saw him as a threat to her family and feared a repeat of past incidents. The Orania community had welcomed Louise with open arms. Members of the Dutch Reformed Church helped her secure housing and employment. Louise hoped this small, tight-knit settlement home to just over 1,000 people would be the perfect place to rebuild her life and leave behind years of suffering and turmoil. Known for its low crime rate, Aria's population, largely descended from Dutch, German, and French settlers, worked together to create a safe and supportive environment. But Louise's new sense of peace began to unravel after Cobus entered her life. Despite his troubled history, he quickly integrated into her social circle and became a frequent visitor to her home on the surface. His behavior seemed harmless, but whispers about his past began circulating, causing some to question how safe his presence really was. Concerns escalated when Johann started exhibiting unusual behavior at preschool teachers noted. Noticed that the boy avoided interaction, often hiding and showing reluctance to return home at the end of the day. This raised alarms, especially as both Johann and Poppy appeared visibly uncomfortable at the thought of leaving with their family. Cobus, who often came to pick them up, left a negative impression on the preschool staff. His cold and irritable demeanor toward the children was impossible to ignore. These observations led teachers to suspect that something was deeply wrong in Louise and Cass's household. The troubles began immediately after Louise and Cass's wedding on November 14, 2015. Just one day after their marriage was registered, Cobus insisted that Marissa Lewis's 14-year-old stepdaughter leave their home. She was abruptly sent by bus to her father. This decision was a shock for Johann and Poppy, who were deeply attached to their older sister Marissa, had taken care of them, given them attention, and her departure was a traumatic experience for them. They couldn't understand why their beloved sister was no longer with them, while her place was taken by someone who showed no interest in connecting with them after Marissa's departure. Johann and Poppy became moody, withdrawn, and began to fall ill more frequently. These changes coincided with their starting daycare, as neither Louise nor Cobus could watch over them at home anymore. Because of work, daycare staff started noticing odd behavior in Johann. Sometimes his reactions were slow, almost as though he were under the influence of sedatives. When asked about the boy's condition, his parents gave vague answers or sometimes joked about it. Although these suspicions were never confirmed, the children's behavior continued to cause concern. Poppy, the younger of the two, started crying more often, and Johann frequently hid in secluded places, especially when Cobus came to pick them up. Teachers noted that the siblings seemed afraid to go home, but they were unable to intervene directly. Cobus himself often came across as impatient and irritated, particularly when the children cried or behaved energetically. Louise, on the other hand, seemed distant, exhausted and preoccupied with work, which, according to the daycare staff, likely prevented her from noticing the situation. The family's troubles continued to worsen. Cobus avoided building a relationship with the children, and his behavior toward them grew increasingly cold and detached. Meanwhile, Louise began to realize that her hopes for a new life with him were falling apart at the time. However, she had no idea of the consequences she was about to face. The first major turning point came when Poppy stopped attending daycare. This happened after staff began asking questions about the bruises that appeared frequently on her body. Despite her speech difficulties, the little girl tried to explain what was happening at home, but her descriptions were jumbled and unclear. Staff noticed that the bruises often appeared in unusual places, like her ears or the insides of her arms, areas not typically associated with accidental injuries. Louise and Cobus repeatedly assured them that the bruises were the result of active play, claiming that Johann often pushed his sister and that she, being clumsy, frequently fell and hurt herself. By this time, Johann was still attending daycare, but his behavior was raising increasing concerns. The boy refused to take off his warm clothes. Even on hot summer days, he would arrive wearing a jacket and pants. Despite the heat, caregivers tried to persuade him to change into lighter clothing, but Johann strongly resisted and repeatedly said that his parents would be angry if he removed his clothes. When the caregivers finally decided to check under his clothes, they found bruises. After this incident, Louise and Cobus stopped bringing Johann to daycare, claiming he was difficult to manage. Around the same time, Louise began stating that Johann was acting aggressively toward his sister. She explained his absence by suggesting he couldn't control his emotions and could pose a danger to others. The daycare staff noticed that this withdrawal happened right after they began asking questions about Johann's unusual condition. They suspected that the parents might have pulled him out to avoid further scrutiny. Poppy often woke up crying at night, trying to muffle her sobs so as not to attract attention, but her quiet weeping could be heard through the thin walls. Her neighbor recalled that this happened nearly every night. The parents appeared to completely ignore her tears when they did intervene. It was only to shout harshly at her to stop crying over time. The neighbor noticed that Poppy's nightly crying episodes were accompanied by other alarming signs that could not be ignored. One in that stood out to the neighbor involved, seeing Poppy with her leg in a cast. He recalled that the girl was brought home in the back of a pickup truck instead of helping her out of the vehicle. Neither parent offered any assistance. Poppy had to climb out on her own, struggling with her injury and carrying a heavy backpack rather than showing concern. Kobus impatiently rushed her, telling her to hurry up. The neighbor was shocked by this display of indifference and began suspecting that something was seriously wrong in the household. The incident with Poppy's broken leg, according to the neighbor, occurred after he had heard Kobus yelling at her. The shouts and insults could be heard through the house's windows, and shortly after the yelling was replaced by crying. This time, however, the crying sounded different, more like a scream of pain. The next day, Poppy was seen with her leg in a cast, making it clear that she had suffered a significant injury. The neighbor's suspicions were further fueled by other observations. He frequently heard arguments in the house. The parents' shouting often escalated into verbal attacks with hurtful comments, hurled back and forth almost daily. It seemed that even minor issues such as mischief from the children could set off bursts of anger. Although the neighbor never witnessed physical punishment firsthand, he strongly suspected that physical discipline accompanied the verbal abuse. The situation in Louise and Cass's home increasingly drew the attention of those around them. At first, it was limited to occasional remarks and speculation, but over time the number of troubling incidents grew. This became especially noticeable after the children stopped attending daycare altogether. In August 2016, Child Protection Services held a meeting with Louise and Kobus. The parents were ordered to attend regular sessions with a family psychologist and bring Johan and Poppy for weekly checkups with a pediatrician. This decision came after numerous reports from neighbors and daycare staff, but it took considerable effort to prompt authorities to intervene. Prior to this, the family's neighbor had repeatedly reported alarming incidents. One of the most shocking moments for him occurred when he saw Johan and Poppy standing outside in freezing weather, shivering from the cold. Kobus, holding a hose with icy water, sprayed them and forced them to strip down. He then made them repeat some sort of apology. The neighbor, observing this, couldn't understand what had triggered such cruel behavior. The children, who had been sitting quietly on the porch before the incident, had done nothing to cause trouble, according to Kobus. However, they had supposedly done something to provoke his anger for the neighbor. This incident was the breaking point, and he decided to contact Child Protection Services despite his report. The situation didn't change immediately. The case wasn't referred to the police, and the neighbor's complaint was initially ignored. He had to contact multiple organizations to get anyone to pay attention. In the small settlement where the family lived, there was no local police station or courthouse, which made holding Kobus accountable even more challenging still. The neighbor refused to give up. In September 2016, the family suddenly vanished from their home. The neighbor, who had been keeping an eye on the situation, woke up one morning to find the house empty. Neither Louise nor Kobus informed him or the daycare staff about any plans to move. Kobus also hadn't resigned from his job, making the situation even stranger. The neighbor was convinced the family had fled to avoid further investigations and accountability. The family relocated to the Mammaly farm several hours away from their previous home. Louise's mother lived there, though she rarely interacted with her daughter or grandchildren due to strained family relationships now. However, they were all under one roof when the grandmother saw Johan and Poppy. She was shocked. Their bodies were covered in bruises, some of which were clearly recent. She immediately asked Johan what had happened. Despite being scared, the boy admitted that Kobus was responsible. Louise, who was present during this exchange, quickly interrupted, insisting that her son was making up stories. The grandmother, who had spent years living with an abusive partner herself, knew something terrible was happening in her daughter's home. Unsure of what to do, she decided to seek advice from the local pastor instead of offering support. The pastor accused her of meddling too much and said Louise needed to handle her family issues on her own. Discouraged, the grandmother stopped trying to seek help, fearing that any action she took might make things worse for her grandchildren. The family had been skipping the mandatory medical checkups ordered by Child Protection Services for several weeks. However, during one of their rare visits, doctors noticed new bruises on Poppy's body. Despite these findings, the injuries were not properly documented. One of the doctors failed to record the marks, citing that the girl couldn't clearly explain their cause, while her mother claimed the bruises were from frequent falls. This allowed the parents to evade accountability, even as the signs of mistreatment became increasingly apparent. On October 25, 2016, Louise arrived at the local hospital carrying Poppy. In her arms, she was shouting that her daughter had fallen ill and begged the medical staff for help. But Poppy was already deceased. Doctors attempted resuscitation, but it was too late. The injuries on Poppy's body immediately raised serious concerns. Bruises covered nearly her entire body, including areas where such injuries are highly unusual. When asked about the origins of the bruises, Louise claimed that Poppy had hit herself against the sides of the car during a bumpy ride on the way to the hospital. The medical staff quickly noted Louise's odd behavior. She appeared detached, showed no signs of grief, and seemed more concerned with avoiding trouble with the police. Comparing Poppy's condition with Louise's explanation, the doctors realized the situation required immediate involvement from law enforcement. An autopsy revealed that Poppy had numerous injuries at various stages of healing, providing critical evidence of long-term mistreatment. The bruises couldn't be explained away as accidental bumps against furniture or mishandling during transportation in the back of a pickup truck. When this information was handed over to the police, it became clear that Poppy's death was likely the result of prolonged abuse. Johan, 5 years old at the time, and present at the hospital with his parents, became a focus of concern for the medical staff. The boy kept his distance from Louise, and Cobus avoided eye contact with them and hid in a corner of the room. His body also showed signs of bruising, and when questioned, he quietly repeated that Poppy didn't want to eat anymore. The doctors suspected these words might be connected to the events leading to Poppy's death, and immediately contacted the police. The first officer to arrive at the scene was deeply disturbed by the photographs of Poppy's injuries. The extent and severity of the bruises on such a young child left him visibly shaken. Without delay, the police took Cobus into custody. Though Louise was not immediately arrested, authorities believed she might also have been a victim of abuse. As the investigation unfolded, detectives tried to piece together the sequence of events, using statements from neighbors, the grandmother, and even Cobus himself. However, the accounts varied significantly, leaving many unanswered questions about the final days leading to Poppy's tragic death. During questioning, Louise claimed that the day before the tragedy, Poppy had accidentally hit her head on a cabinet. She described how on the morning of October 25th, the girl appeared lethargic and barely moved. Later in the day, Cobus returned home, and according to Louise, he was often in a bad mood. She stated that she warned him not to bother the children due to their condition, but he ignored her. Louise alleged that she saw him kick Poppy in the stomach. However, instead of intervening, she said she left the house to go grocery shopping. When she returned, Cobus reportedly told her that something was wrong with Poppy. Louise said she found her daughter unconscious in an empty bathtub. Poppy's lips had turned blue. Her body was cold and she was unresponsive. The couple attempted CPR, but it was unsuccessful. Instead of calling emergency services, they decided to take her to the hospital themselves. They placed Poppy in the bed of their pickup truck, later claiming this explained the numerous bruises on her body. This version of events was met with skepticism by everyone familiar with the situation. Poppy's grandmother, upon seeing the state of her granddaughter, didn't believe Louise's account. She recalled recent incidents when she had noticed bruises on the children and tried to draw attention to the issue. She also remembered how the pastor she had sought advice from discouraged her from taking further action, insisting she shouldn't interfere in Louise's life. The investigation gained momentum when a doctor who examined Poppy's body stated that the injuries couldn't possibly have been accidental. Testimonies from neighbors, the grandmother, and other witnesses were collected. The evidence, along with Louise and Cass's conflicting explanations, laid the foundation for accusations of prolonged mistreatment. Forensic examinations revealed that Poppy had endured severe physical abuse over an extended period. The nature of her injuries indicated that she had been stalked or struck with hands and feet and thrown against walls or furniture. The primary cause of death was a traumatic brain injury resulting in a fatal hemorrhage. Poppy's body bore numerous bruises and abrasions, concentrated on her face, chest, and thighs. Experts concluded that these injuries were not the result of a single act but rather systematic and deliberate harm. The findings shocked the local community, but the public's outrage was further fueled by the fact that Louise remained free for some time while Kobus was in custody and facing attacks from other inmates. Suspicion began to grow that Louise might have been just as complicit in the ongoing abuse in the days leading up to Poppy's funeral. Tensions boiled over two women pretending to be police officers convinced Lisa to go with them to the station. Instead, they drove her outside of town and assaulted her, claiming they were avenging Poppy's death at Poppy's funeral. Louisa appeared with visible signs of injuries. However, this didn't elicit sympathy from those present. The girl's biological father, Christo Vanar, attended the ceremony and openly accused his ex-wife of failing to protect their daughter. He believed Louise had always been indifferent to her children throughout the service. Louise appeared detached, avoided interaction, and showed no visible emotion, further deepening suspicions about her involvement. Louise was arrested a month and a half after the funeral on December 15, 2016. She was charged with the same crimes as Kobus. However, her arrest and the subsequent investigation were fraught with challenges. The trial didn't begin until October 2017, primarily due to difficulties finding lawyers willing to represent the accused and Cass's deteriorating mental state, as he had attempted self-harm multiple times in jail. A pivotal moment in the case was the testimony of Johan. Poppy's brother Johan revealed that Kobus routinely hurt both him and Poppy, while Louise stood by and did nothing to intervene. According to Johan, his mother often witnessed the abuse and even defended Cass's actions to others. He also contradicted Louise's claims about trying to resuscitate Poppy. Johan testified that after Kobus had hurt Poppy, he dunked her head into a toilet in an attempt to wake her up. While Louise simply stood by without taking any action, Johan's testimony became the cornerstone for the charges against Louise. It corroborated statements from neighbors, the grandmother, and medical experts, painting a complete picture of systematic mistreatment within the household. The trial concluded with a sentence that marked the end of a long and complex case. Louise and Kobus were found guilty of Poppy's death and were each sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Additionally, the court added 10 more years to their sentences for the ongoing mistreatment and threats against Johan. While delivering the verdict, the judge emphasized the extraordinary cruelty of their actions and noted their lack of remorse throughout the trial. The investigation revealed that in the months leading up to Poppy's death, the family's neighbor had repeatedly tried to draw attention to the situation. He reported seeing bruises on both Poppy and Johan, hearing constant yelling, and noticing the parents' suspicious behavior. However, his complaints were not properly addressed. Representatives of Child Protection Services later claimed that logistical challenges and bureaucratic delays had hindered their ability to act. Despite this, no one from the agency faced consequences for their failure to intervene during the trial. It also came to light that Louise and Kobus had made no meaningful effort to save Poppy when her condition worsened. Instead, they placed her in the bed of a pickup truck and drove to the hospital, despite the fact that she was already deceased. They attempted to blame her bruises on the bumpy road, but medical examinations proved the injuries had been inflicted long before that. Poppy's death sparked widespread public outrage. Many in the community believed Child Protection Services should have acted sooner, while the agency offered explanations. No one was held accountable for the negligence that attributed to the tragedy. The verdict brought a sense of justice to a family that had operated outside the system's oversight. Despite clear signs of mistreatment, this case highlighted severe flaws in the child protection system and underscored the urgent need for reforms to prevent such tragedies from happening again.